What if I told you there was once a king so unsettling to behold that his own people whispered he was marked by the devil, a monarch whose body felt like a verdict written in bone and blood? Meet Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado the Bewitched. And if you dare to walk the night corridors of his palace with me to see how a dynasty's pride turned into a private hell, hit subscribe now, because before this is over you'll hear what the physicians wrote after they opened him and why those words still make candles tremble. Picture Madrid under a steel blue dawn frost silvering the tiles, the Alcazar breathing incense, and smoke courtiers drifting like shadows along galleries of black and gold. Spain still calls itself the anvil of Christendom. Silver from the Indies rattling in strongbox's banners, stiff with victories long ago, and at the center of all that thunder sits a boy king, born in 1661, the last pure thread of a family that tied its knots too tightly. From the first hours the palace understood the cost of its crown. The labor was long, the infant fragile, and the bells that should have rung with uncomplicated triumph sounded as though wrapped in cloth. Astrologers argued over signs, midwives crossed themselves, and somewhere in the endless rooms a rumor curled like smoke. The dynasty had kept its blood too close to itself, and the bill had come due. Imagine a family tree that does not branch so much as fold a mirror hall, where the same jawline repeats down the generations, while the roots circle and choke the trunk. Cousins wed cousins to protect territory, uncles married nieces to protect names, and across the parchment of genealogy the ink looks thick-clotted insistently, the same until medicine would have to untangle what pride had woven. Charles's childhood sounded like a clock that missed beats. Words arrived, late teeth met wrong. Chewing felt like work, and small fevers came and went the way drafts haunted the palace. Nurses warmed milk with spices, confessors prescribed prayers, physicians prescribed pearl powder and bezoar stones, while somewhere in the corridors someone always whispered that the devil meddled where doctors failed. Behind the nursery door, another storm brewed. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled as regent, and the court split into blades. French agents murmuring of friendship, Austrian envoys promising safety grandees, sharpening old grievances. The smell of beeswax and parchment hung heavy as the Privy Council debated a nation's fate while its future coughed behind velvet curtains. The nickname arrived early like a label hammered into wood, El Hechizado the Bewitched. Exorcists were summoned between physicians' relics touched to a timid brow. Holy water dampened pillows, and morning after morning, the prescriptions changed tonics of amber, cordials of cinnamon, a regimen of baths and blessings, until even the apothecaries began to look afraid of their own cupboards. In 1679, the court pinned its hopes to a marriage. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, niece to the Sun King, crossed mountains to a city of trumpets and suspicion. Their wedding was all lace and music and prayers for heirs, and afterward the palace lived between polite smiles and the quiet arithmetic of months passing while midwives and ministers turned fertility into statecraft and meals into medicine. Marie-Louise learned the geometry of loneliness, the foreign bride who spoke with brightness but slept under the weight of a country's expectations, seeking solace in gardens, horses, and letters home. When her health faltered and death came in 1689, the corridors swallowed the sound, and the city filled the silence with theories, illness, melancholy, poison, because grief in a palace is never simple, only useful. The second marriage arrived almost immediately. Mariana of Neuburg, with a dowry of alliances and a reputation for determination. New physicians, new regimes, new saints' days marked with newer vows. Yet the arithmetic remained stubborn, and as the years tightened their grip, the whisper of bewitchment grew louder, until the palace tried everything at once, remedies and rituals, syrups and psalms, while Europe watched a great crown tremble on a head that seemed too tired to lift it, and still no child. By the 1690s, Spain itself seemed to mirror the king. Its limbs heavy, its breath uneven, its future uncertain. Silver fleets arrived thinner, soldiers grumbled of pay, unpaid provinces muttered of neglect, and foreign ambassadors wrote home about a monarch whose every gesture was slow, whose very presence made councils last twice as long, because words caught in his throat like knots in rope. The court tried to disguise what it could not repair, elaborate wigs to cover the thinning hair silks and brocades to distract from a body too frail, heralds proclaiming strength while whispers seeped through keyholes. And still the people gave him names, not meant for kings, muttering of curses of witchcraft, of a bloodline that had tempted heaven too long and now paid in flesh. Physicians multiplied around him like shadows. Some swore his stomach could digest nothing but chocolate. Others prescribed ground gemstones mixed with wine. Still others bled him until his lips blanched. Every cure left him weaker, every treatment more absurd, until he resembled a vessel into which superstition and science poured equally without filling. Yet the king himself, timid but devout, believed deeply in the rituals performed over him. He fasted, he prayed, he endured examinations with patience, and when priests muttered about exorcisms, he submitted. Behind his large, solemn eyes lingered not malice, but weariness, as though he understood he was less a sovereign than a living omen. When rival powers looked at Spain, they no longer saw its armies but its heir, or rather the absence of one. France sharpened its claim through Bourbon blood. Austria pressed its Habsburg line, and treaties were drafted like wagers on a failing body. In every embassy and every council chamber of Europe, Charles's health became the weather report, a sudden fever. Here could tilt the balance of continents. Rumors grew wilder with each passing year that his second wife had bewitched him with enchanted chocolate, that witches stole his seed, that demons sat on his chest at night. Inquisitors convened not only to police heresy, but to weigh whether the king himself was victim of sorcery, and exorcists were summoned as if the throne were not a seat of state, but a battlefield for unseen forces. In 1698, desperate, the court permitted a full-scale ritual. Priests gathered at dawn, chanting as they bound amulets to the king's body, holy relics pressed against his skin, while candles smoked thick enough to choke. Observers wrote that Charles sat trembling eyes wide, lips muttering prayers, a monarch turned penitent patient in a theater of faith and fear. None of it restored him. He stumbled through audiences, signatures dragged across decrees. His speech slurred, his memory broken by pauses, until courtiers learned to pretend they understood. Foreign visitors described him as if they were describing a ghost, present, visible, but already half absent from the world of the living. By 1700, it was clear the candle was guttering nights filled with fits. Days with exhaustion servants lifting him into chairs, his body swollen in some places and wasted in others. Still, he clung to rosaries, to relics, to a sense of duty that made him summon ministers, though his voice cracked and faltered, insisting Spain must endure, even as he himself was fading. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died at the age of 39. The bells of Madrid told, the courtiers crossed themselves, and Europe braced for war. But the true horror was only revealed afterward, when physicians performed the autopsy and recorded what they found inside a body that had carried not just one man's life, but the decaying legacy of an empire. The autopsy notes read like something between a confession and a curse. His body, they wrote, was one of the most extraordinary ever seen, his chest cavernous, his heart shriveled and dry, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrid. The description spread quickly through Europe, half medical record, half ghost story, and courtiers repeated them in hushed tones, as though they had seen evidence of hell itself. Most chilling of all was the report of his head. His skull was said to be full of water. His brain, small, soft, almost melted. His body bore no trace of vigor, no possibility of life continuing. It was as if nature had written, line by line, the price of centuries of royal inbreeding across his very organs and then signed it with his early death. To the common people, the autopsy confirmed every suspicion he had been bewitched, yes, but not by sorcery from without. The devil's mark lay within in the mingling of two close bloodlines in a dynasty that married itself into extinction. The whispers that had haunted the corridors became a lesson retold in taverns and plazas and sermons. His death triggered what historians now call the War of the Spanish Succession, but to contemporaries it felt like the sky itself had cracked open. Foreign soldiers marched, alliances shifted, and for more than a decade, Europe bled to decide who would inherit a throne once thought eternal. Charles's body, frail in life, heavy in death, had become the weight that dragged half a continent into war. In Madrid, meanwhile, the memory of his reign turned into a fog of superstition and dread. Some swore they saw his shadow in the palace long after he was buried. Others claimed his death brought sudden storms, and pamphlets circulated describing his autopsy as though it were a prophecy that Spain would never again be the empire it once was. And in truth, Spain's decline deepened. After him, silver fleets shrank, provinces slipped away, and the Bourbon dynasty that followed could never quite erase the image of the bewitched king. Whenever famine struck, whenever soldiers mutinied, people muttered that the curse of Charles still lingered, that his body had poisoned the roots of the empire itself. Yet, to modern eyes, the tragedy is more rational, but no less horrifying. Not demons, but genetics. Not witchcraft, but dynastic arrogance. Centuries of intermarriage that left a king so malformed he could barely stand, and so infertile he could not leave an heir. The very strategies meant to protect power had hollowed it out from within. Charles II stands as a symbol not only of one man's suffering, but of what happens when the lust for control ignores the limits of nature. His reign was not the triumph of Spain's power, but its echo, a long dying note that reminded everyone watching that no dynasty, however mighty, could conquer the laws of blood and bone. Even today, historians study his case not only for its political consequences, but as one of the most striking examples of hereditary collapse in human history. Medical textbooks describe the Habsburg jaw geneticists trace the lines of ancestry, while storytellers return again and again to the haunting image of a king who looked cursed because his lineage had become its own prison. And so, the tale of Charles II of Spain is told with a shiver part, cautionary tale part, ghost story part, anatomy lesson. A reminder that behind the silk and the crowns beneath the painted portraits lies a body, fragile and mortal, bearing the weight of choices made long before it drew breath. Choices that turned a throne into a tomb. Imagine the court that watched him age, every banquet hushed when he entered every diplomatic gathering tense, because ambassadors knew they were staring not at a monarch with a future, but at a question with no answer. Each cough, each stumble, each fainting spell sent ripples across Europe like a stone dropped in water. Foreign powers hovered like vultures above the palace. France pushed its Bourbon claim, Austria insisted on its Habsburg rights, and every noble in Spain whispered their allegiance to one side or another, depending on whether the king survived a fever or awoke from another fit. The king's body was the map, and everyone was drawing borders on it. Charles himself became increasingly withdrawn, though his devotion to religion deepened. He spent hours in prayer, often kneeling until his body trembled, convinced his misfortunes were signs of sin or enchantment. Priests encouraged exorcisms, rituals, blessings upon blessings, turning the royal chamber into something closer to a monastery than a throne room. The people outside the palace grew restless. Harvests failed, soldiers deserted, silver shipments dwindled. While their monarch sought salvation in relics and processions, they sought bread. Superstition filled the gap. Rumors claimed witches haunted Madrid streets, stealing the king's strength, or that demons appeared in the smoke of the palace chimneys. When Charles ordered investigations into witchcraft, inquisitors marched proudly into villages, dragging women and men before tribunals. But instead of restoring his strength, the trials only deepened fear. Each execution, each accusation whispered that Spain itself was bewitched, and all the while the king wasted further away. His second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, became an object of suspicion. Her enemies accused her of poisoning him, of sabotaging his fertility, of secretly serving Austria's interests rather than Spain's. She fought back with her own faction wielding influence behind locked doors, while her husband, frail and passive, was little more than a pawn in their hands. By the late 1690s, foreign diplomats described Charles as more dead than alive. Some claimed he could barely chew his food, others that he was often carried to council in a chair, his body swollen, his eyes sunken. Each report spread like wildfire across Europe, fueling the expectation that his death would light the fuse of war. Yet still, he lived lingering like a ghost the world could not quite bury. His presence was both a blessing and a curse. The longer he survived, the longer Spain remained whole, but the longer Europe sharpened its knives in anticipation of his inevitable end. When Charles finally signed his will in 1700, he named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIII of France, as his heir. It was less a decision than a surrender to inevitability. The choice outraged Austria and terrified England, both unwilling to see France gain Spain's crown. The ink on that document was blood on the map of Europe. And then, on November 1st of that same year, the bewitched king breathed his last. The palace bells told, courtiers wept or pretended to, but outside those walls in the chancelleries of Europe, ministers drew up plans for war. The man who had seemed cursed in life had in death cursed the continent with one of its bloodiest conflicts. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted almost immediately, a conflagration that drew in nearly every major European power. To many, it seemed as though Charles II's frail body had been the dam holding back a flood, and with his death the waters rushed forth, drowning battlefields from Flanders to Italy. In villages across Spain, the people spoke of it not as politics, but as prophecy fulfilled. They whispered that Charles's ghost walked the corridors of the Alcazar, thin and pale, his jaw slack, his hands trembling with invisible rosaries. Each defeat in war, each famine at home was blamed on the curse of El Hechizado lingering beyond the grave. Portraits of him still hung in the great halls, painted with all the dignity the artists could conjure. But anyone who looked too long at those canvases saw the truth: features distorted lips, thick eyes shadowed. These were not merely royal portraits. They were warnings painted in oil, reminders of the dynasty's decay. And yet, even in this frailty, Charles became legend. For centuries afterward, storytellers turned his life into parable. To peasants, he was the bewitched king who proved the devil stalked thrones as easily as cottages. To nobles, he was a symbol of how power hoarded too jealously could collapse under its own weight. Historians, however, would strip the story of devils and spells and find something darker: the mathematics of bloodlines. Inbreeding, coefficients, genealogical charts, the relentless closing of a family circle. Charles II became the most famous medical case study of hereditary collapse, his body and anatomy lesson carved across a kingdom's history. The autopsy details, grim as they were, became a kind of folklore of their own. People repeated the lines with horror: a head full of water, a heart the size of a walnut, intestines putrefied. It was as though the physicians had written not only a medical report, but a cautionary sermon to echo through the ages. Priests used his story in homilies, warning against pride and sin. Physicians cited him in lectures as proof that even kings were subject to nature's law. Political writers recalled him whenever dynasties plotted too closely. Charles became more useful in death than he had ever been in life, a relic of warning more than a monarch remembered. Yet beneath the legend, one cannot forget the boy who grew up in corridors of shadow, who struggled to walk, to eat, to speak, who prayed each night for relief and never found it. His life was not only the downfall of an empire, but the long, slow suffering of a human being caught in the gears of history. And this is why Charles II haunts us still, not simply as a king who looked bewitched, but as a mirror to the cost of power maintained at any price. His face, his bones, his empty nursery rooms. These are monuments not to demons, but to human choices repeated until they crushed both man and empire. So, when you hear his name, Charles II of Spain el Hechizado, remember the echo that followed his death, war, famine, collapse. A life that seemed cursed, but in truth was the inevitable result of decisions made generations before. His body was the stage, but the play was written long before he was born. After his death, pamphlets circulated across Europe, blending fact with rumor until the line blurred completely. Some described Charles as a walking corpse long before his final breath, others insisted he had spoken to demons, and still more swore that witches had cursed his bedchamber. The real tragedy was less supernatural, yet far more terrifying because it was real. In France, Louis XIV boasted that his grandson now wore the Spanish crown, but in the same breath he muttered about the fragility of empires. He had seen with his own eyes how a dynasty that ruled half the world could rot from the inside out. For every Bourbon courtier celebrating another whispered that the fate of the Habsburgs might one day be theirs. Austria, enraged at losing its claim, painted Charles as both victim and villain in propaganda, the weakling who betrayed his bloodline, they sneered. Yet, at the same time, they held up his tragedy as proof that the Spanish branch had failed nature itself. The war of words was as bitter as the war of armies. In Spain, people told stories of Charles's final days as if they were folk tales. Children were warned not to lie, or they would end up bewitched like the king. Markets buzzed with tales of his autopsy, exaggerated each time one day his skull was said to contain water, the next day snakes. Memory transformed into myth. But scholars today peel back the myth to reveal something colder, the relentless arithmetic of inbreeding. Charles's family tree, when mapped, shows loops instead of branches. Ancestors appear multiple times, their blood recycled until the line collapsed in on itself. He was less a man than the final sum of generations of ambition, and yet in portraits there is a strange dignity. His eyes, often painted too large, carry a kind of haunted sorrow, as if he knew he was less a king than a symbol, less a ruler than a warning. Historians debate whether he understood his role, but the gaze in those paintings makes one wonder if he did. The irony is that Spain, which claimed to defend the faith with iron and fire, could not defend its own dynasty from the quiet curse of pride. Charles's reign became a sermon without words that no empire, however vast, can defy the limits of the human body or the silent rebellion of nature itself. Even today, geneticists and historians return to him the most famous medical monarch in European history. His condition is dissected in classrooms, his image shown in documentaries, his life retold as a symbol of hereditary collapse. The king, who was once pitied or mocked, has become an enduring case study, and still the ghost of superstition clings to his name. In Spain, legends of El Hechizado linger in rural folklore, blending science with old fears. To some, he remains the king who proved demons exist. To others, the king who proved that men can create demons of their own through arrogance. Perhaps that is why his story endures, because it is not only about a cursed man or a cursed crown, but about us, the choices we make, the patterns we repeat, the warnings we ignore. Charles II may have died more than 3 centuries ago, but his body still speaks quietly of what power can do when it refuses to listen. In the archives of Madrid, his autopsy record still lies under glass, the ink brown and fragile, but the words retain their sting. Students who read it today shiver not because of demons, but because they see in it the cost of human arrogance disguised as tradition. The physicians who wrote those lines never imagined their report would become legend. Generations after, writers like Voltaire pointed to Charles as the embodiment of a monarchy devouring itself. For Enlightenment thinkers, he was evidence that superstition and unchecked dynastic pride led not to divine order, but to chaos. His reign was quoted in debates that slowly pushed Europe toward new ideas of governance and medicine. But among the common people, his legacy lived differently. Songs and whispered tales carried the image of a king whose lips were too heavy, whose speech was slow, whose eyes rolled back in prayer. Some pitied him as a victim of dark forces, others feared him as an omen. Either way, El Hechizado became a figure no one could forget, and while armies clashed over his throne in the War of the Spanish Succession, the ordinary Spaniards remembered something more intimate: the long years of famine, the empty promises, the eerie processions through Madrid, where the frail king lifted holy relics with trembling hands, as if each ceremony might hold back the collapse of an empire. Portraits of Charles still hang in galleries today, framed in gold, but they unsettle more than they impress. Tourists linger before them, uneasy, unsure if the artist flattered or condemned. In those features, the jutting jaw, the hollow eyes, they sense not majesty, but fragility, as though the paint itself sighs with the weight of centuries. For Spain, his death marked the end of one world and the violent birth of another. Bourbon kings would rule. Wars would rage, but the shadow of El Hechizado never lifted entirely. He became a reminder carved into the national memory, the king who was less a ruler than a question posed by fate itself. Even modern documentaries cannot resist his story. They frame him by candlelight, whisper his nickname, recount the grotesque details of his autopsy, and always return to the same haunting conclusion: Charles II was not cursed by demons, but by decisions made long before he was born. And therein lies the true horror, not that one man suffered, but that an entire empire gambled its future, on blood kept too pure, on traditions held too tightly, on power preserved at the cost of life itself. His tragedy was not random, it was deliberate, written in the choices of kings and queens who thought themselves above consequence. To look at Charles II is to look at a mirror. How often do societies cling to practices long past their usefulness, convinced they protect strength, while in truth they feed weakness? How often do we build curses with our own hands, and then blame the supernatural when they come due? So, when the bells tolled on November 1st, 1700, and the last Habsburg of Spain lay still, it was more than a death. It was the closing of a chapter written in blood and pride, a chapter whose echo still trembles in history's halls. Charles II, the Bewitched, became immortal, not through power, but through the haunting lesson of his fall.